Alone in a creaking house, something sinister lurks in the shadows.
As Halloween night settled over the small town of Millhaven, the air was thick with excitement. Kids in costumes ran from house to house, their voices filling the air with laughter and joy. Among them was Ella, a curious 16-year-old who had always felt Halloween held a different kind of magic one that called to her. This year, her friends had dared her to enter the infamous Pendergast Manor, a crumbling Victorian mansion that sat on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for decades, and rumors swirled about strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions within its walls. Ella was nervous, but the thrill of the dare was too tempting to pass up. She met her friends, Lily, Jake, and Tom, at the manor just as the moon rose, casting an eerie glow over the dilapidated house. Its broken windows looked like hollow eyes staring into the night, and the overgrown garden seemed to whisper as the wind rustled through it.
"Are you sure you want to do this?"
Lily asked, glancing nervously at the house.
"Come on, it's just an old house,"
Ella replied, masking her fear with a shaky laugh.
"Let's get in, take a picture, and get out. Easy."
Jake pushed open the rusty iron gate, which groaned loudly as if warning them to turn back. The four friends made their way up the cracked stone path, feeling the chill of the October air deepening as they approached the house. When they reached the door, Tom tried the handle, and to their surprise, it swung open with ease. Inside, the house was dark and silent. Dust coated every surface, and the air was stale. The hall stretched out before them, lined with faded wallpaper that seemed to peel away in sorrowful strips. As they moved forward, their footsteps echoed, and the old wood creaked beneath their weight.
"All right, let's find the main room and take a picture,"
Ella whispered, her voice barely breaking the silence. They walked down the hall, their flashlights casting narrow beams of light that barely cut through the darkness. A strange feeling settled over them, as if they were being watched, yet no one said a word. Finally, they reached the main room, a grand space with a dusty chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling and furniture draped in white sheets like specters. Jake pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the group. Just as the flash went off, a sound echoed from upstairs, a faint, dragging noise that sent chills down their spines. Everyone froze, their eyes darting to the staircase.
"Probably just the house settling,"
Tom muttered, though his voice shook. They stared at each other, nervous laughter bubbling up, but Ella felt a strange pull toward the staircase. It was as if something was calling her, urging her to go up. Ignoring her friends' protests, she slowly ascended, each step creaking beneath her. Her friends reluctantly followed, their unease growing with every step. At the top of the stairs was a long, dark hallway lined with doors. Ella's flashlight caught the edge of a door at the far end. It was slightly ajar, and she felt a compulsion to open it. She approached, heart pounding, and gently pushed it open. Inside, she found a small, dimly lit room with a large mirror on the wall. Its surface was dusty, but something about it seemed off. She felt a chill as she gazed into it, and then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection, a figure stood behind her, a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a sinister smile. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Her friends crowded into the room, and she gestured toward the mirror.
"Look, there was someone behind me."
Lily took a step forward, staring into the mirror, but saw only their reflections.
"Maybe it was a trick of the light,"
she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Ella looked back, but the figure was gone. She tried to shake off the unease and turned to leave the room. As she did, she noticed the air had grown colder, and a low whisper seemed to fill the hallway, as if someone or something was speaking directly to her.
"Did you guys hear that?"
she asked, but they all shook their heads. They moved quickly down the stairs, but halfway down, the door at the end of the hall slammed shut. echoing through the empty house. They all froze, panic gripping them. Tom rushed forward, yanking at the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if an unseen force was holding it closed. Jake yelled, banging on the door, but there was no response, only the oppressive silence that had settled around them. Then the whispers began again, louder this time, echoing through the house.
You shouldn't have come.
Lily began to cry, her sobs muffled as she clung to Jake. Ella felt her own terror rising, but she forced herself to stay calm, scanning the room for another exit. Just as she spotted a window they might be able to climb through, the lights flickered on, casting a dim glow over the room. In the sudden light, they saw them, figures standing in the corners of the room cloaked in shadow, their faces pale and expressionless. There were 4 of them, matching each of the friends, their hollow eyes watching them with silent malice. Ella backed away, feeling a cold hand grip her arm. She gasped, turning to see one of the figures reaching out to her, its eyes dark and empty. She screamed, pulling free and stumbling back, the room spinning around her. Jake grabbed her hand, dragging her toward the window.
We have to get out of here now.
With all their strength, they broke the glass and scrambled out one by one. They ran into the night, the whispers following them, growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the house. But Ella could feel eyes on her, a lingering presence that refused to let go. Back at home, she tried to shake off the experience, telling herself it was just an illusion. But that night, as she drifted into uneasy sleep, the whispers returned. In her dream, she stood before the mirror in that dark room. The figure appeared behind her once again, only this time it smiled, a wicked, knowing smile that sent shivers down her spine. When she woke, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She looked around her room, heart pounding, but it was empty. Relieved, she tried to calm herself, but then she glanced at the mirror on her wall and froze. There, reflected in the glass, was the shadowy figure, its hollow eyes fixed on her, its hand reaching out as if to pull her back into the darkness. And in the silence, she heard it whisper,
You belong to us now.
As Ella stared at the figure in her mirror, paralyzed with terror, it slowly extended a hand toward her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room felt ice cold, as though the walls themselves were closing in. She wanted to scream but found no voice, only a desperate, sinking feeling as the shadowy hand pressed against the mirror's glass, as if it were trying to break through. With a surge of fear-driven strength, she lunged across the room, pulling a blanket over the mirror to block it from sight. She backed away, her heart pounding, hoping that whatever connection existed between her and the figure would break if she didn't look. But even then, she could still feel its presence, lingering just on the other side, watching her with those dark, empty eyes. At night, Ella tossed and turned, plagued by dreams of the house, the mirror, and the figure. In every dream, it called to her, whispering her name and telling her she didn't belong in the living world anymore. When she woke, drenched in sweat, the whispers echoed faintly in her ears, as if they'd followed her from sleep into waking life. In a desperate attempt to end the nightmare, Ella decided to destroy the mirror. She smashed it with a hammer, shards scattering across her bedroom floor. But in each broken fragment, she saw a glimpse of the shadowy figure, its smile widening as though amused by her efforts. Panic seized her as she realized she couldn't escape it. It was with her now forever. The night of Halloween in the small town of Hollowbrook, draped in an unsettling silence that settled over every house, every street. In the quiet neighborhood of Mulberry Lane, a single house stood out, a once charming Victorian with ivy-covered walls and a garden that had long been overrun by weeds. The townsfolk avoided this house, especially on Halloween, for tales of strange happenings and whispered rumors plagued its history. The house had been vacant for decades, its windows dark and hollow, as if watching over the town with a silent. But this Halloween, lights flickered on inside, casting an eerie glow through the grimy windows. The townsfolk watched from afar, uneasy murmurs passing through the crowd as they wondered who had dared enter the old Hollowbrook house. 4 teenagers, fueled by the thrill of Halloween and a morbid curiosity, had dared each other to explore the house. They were drawn to its forbidden allure, oblivious to the warnings and stories passed down through generations. Armed with flashlights and a bravado that masked their fear, they approached the front door, their shadows merging with the house's dark presence. The door creaked open with an unnatural ease, as though it had been waiting for them, welcoming them into its decaying embrace. Inside, the air was thick and damp, tinged with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. The teenagers shivered as they crossed the threshold, feeling the weight of the house settle upon them like a heavy shroud. The hallway stretched before them, narrow and suffocating, lined with portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow their every step. The portraits were old, their faces painted in an eerie detail, each expression frozen in an unsettling half-smile that seemed to shift when looked at too long. The silence was thick, broken only by the muffled footsteps that echoed through the house. As they ventured deeper, the floorboards creaked underfoot, each groan of wood reverberating through the empty rooms. Their flashlights cast narrow beams of light, illuminating dust particles that floated in the stale air. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting, taking on shapes that seemed almost human. In the dining room, a long table stretched out, covered in a faded lace tablecloth, its surface littered with antique silverware and plates that hadn't been touched in decades. The silver was tarnished, its contents a dark crimson liquid that glistened in the flashlight's beam. A shiver ran down their spines as one of them whispered that it looked like blood. Silence fell again, heavy and oppressive, as the air grew colder, as if the house itself was reacting to their presence. They tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the air was palpable, pressing down on them with an invisible weight. The teenagers moved through the rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. In the parlor, an old piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. Dust covered its surface, but the bench was strangely clear. They lingered, staring at the piano, half expecting it to play on its own, to shatter the silence with a chilling melody. They continued upstairs, their footsteps echoing through the hollow corridors. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched before them, lined with closed doors, each one slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing faded floral patterns beneath, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. At the end of the hallway, a door stood out, a thick wooden door that seemed untouched by time, its surface dark and polished. The teenagers felt drawn to it, their curiosity overpowering their fear. They approached, feeling the tension in the air mount, as if the house itself was holding its breath. With a trembling hand, one of them reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. The hinges creaked, breaking the silence, and they stepped into the room beyond. It was a bedroom, furnished in the style of a bygone era, with a 4-poster bed draped in dusty curtains, and a vanity adorned with cracked glass bottles and a tarnished mirror. In the mirror, they saw their reflections pale and ghostly, their faces distorted by the glass. But behind them something else moved, an indistinct shadow that lurked just out of sight, shifting in the dim light. They spun around, but the room was empty, the shadows still and silent. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in. The door behind them swung shut with a loud bang, trapping them inside. Panic set in as they banged on the door, their voices echoing in the confined space, swallowed by the silence that filled the house. They turned, hearts pounding, as they heard a faint whispering. It was a low, guttural sound, like a voice that hadn't spoken in centuries. The whisper grew louder, filling the room until they could make out the words. It was an incantation, a dark chant that echoed through their minds, leaving them paralyzed with fear. The shadows in the room began to shift, taking shape, forming figures that moved toward them with slow, deliberate steps. The figures were cloaked in darkness, their faces hidden, but their eyes gleamed with a malevolent light that sent chills down their spines. The teenagers tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The figures closed in, their voices merging into a haunting chant that reverberated through the walls, filling the room with an unbearable sense of dread. The shadows reached out, their hands cold and skeletal, grasping at the teenagers with an unrelenting grip. One by one, they felt the darkness seep into their skin, cold and suffocating, as if the house itself was consuming them, pulling them into its depths. Their screams echoed through the empty rooms, but outside, the night remained silent and indifferent to their terror. The next morning, the townsfolk found the house dark and empty, its windows as hollow and lifeless as they had always been. There was no sign of the teenagers, no trace of their presence, as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Over the years, others would enter the house drawn by the same allure, compelled to uncover its secrets, but each one would meet the same fate, disappearing without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of their terror. And on Halloween night, the house would come alive once more, its windows glowing with an eerie light, casting shadows that danced in the darkness. The townsfolk would watch from afar, knowing better than to approach, for they understood that the house was a living entity, a hungry spirit that fed on the souls of those foolish enough to enter. The house remained, a silent sentinel watching over Hollow Brook, its dark presence a constant reminder of the horror that lurked within. As the house settled into silence once more, the townsfolk avoided it with even greater conviction, whispers of its curse spreading. For years, it remained untouched, looming over Hollow Brook with a silent menace. But curiosity has a way of creeping in, and on another Halloween, 5 brave souls from a nearby town dared to test its limits. Drawn by stories of vanished teens and haunted rooms, they sought thrills, unaware they would become part of the legend themselves. The group arrived at dusk, marveling at the house's decayed beauty, the ivy twisting up its walls like a lover's embrace. Laughing nervously, they crossed the overgrown lawn, feeling an odd stillness settle over them. When they reached the door, it swung open before they could touch it. No one mentioned the chill that swept through, only exchanged uneasy glances before stepping inside. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The wallpaper seemed to have aged further, now peeling off in wet, curling strips. Shadows stretched oddly long in the dim light of their flashlights, shifting with each step as if aware of the intruders. The house felt almost alive, its heartbeat a faint, pulsing hum they could barely perceive. They moved from room to room, each filled with the stale scent of decay and dust, and the oppressive weight of silence. The floorboards groaned beneath them as if protesting their presence. In the parlor, an old record player sat silent, a thin layer of dust coating its needle. But as they passed, it clicked on with a crackling hum, playing a low, distorted waltz that echoed eerily. The group exchanged nervous glances, but brushed it off, moving to the grand staircase that spiraled upward. As they climbed, they felt a palpable shift, the air growing colder with each step. When they reached the landing, they noticed the portraits on the wall, faces they didn't recognize, all staring down at them with hollow, knowing eyes. In the upstairs hall, the doors stood slightly ajar, their dark interiors hinting at secrets hidden within. The group huddled closer, their whispers dying on their lips as the house's oppressive silence seemed to swallow even the faintest sound. The long hallway beckoned them forward, as if guiding them deeper into its clutches. One of them noticed a faint light spilling out from the door at the end of the hall. They moved toward it, compelled by an invisible force, and pushed open the door. Inside, a dimly lit room revealed itself, the walls adorned with cracked, yellowed mirrors, all reflecting warped images of the room and themselves. As they stood in the room, the mirrors flickered, their reflections distorting and twisting. The light grew dimmer, casting long, sinister shadows that moved independently of them. One by one, the mirrors began to crack, spiderwebbing with fractures, each shattering with a deafening sound that seemed to echo through the house. Fear surged as they realized the door had closed behind them. Panic set in, and they began to pound on it, their voices rising in terrified pleas, but the door wouldn't budge. Then the room's temperature plummeted, their breath visible as they huddled together, listening to a low, guttural whisper filling the air. The whisper turned into a chant, the words foreign and dark, resonating in their bones. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, taking on ghostly forms that loomed closer. The figures in the mirrors stared at them with empty eyes, their faces slowly splitting into twisted, sinister grins that seemed to mock the trap. Desperation filled the group as they clawed at the door, the mirrors continuing to splinter, each piece reflecting a fractured image of terror. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, a tall, faceless being cloaked in darkness, radiating an aura of malevolence that sent chills through their very souls. The house seemed to draw strength from their fear, its walls pulsating as if it were breathing them in, claiming them as its own. One by one, their screams faded, absorbed into the darkness that pressed around them, leaving only silence behind. May morning, the house sat undisturbed once more, its doors shut tight and windows dark. The townsfolk noticed that 5 more souls had vanished, but no one dared investigate. The legends grew, warning others to stay away from Hollowbrook House on Halloween night. As years passed, the house continued to watch over the town, growing stronger with each passing Halloween. And every so often, if one looked closely enough, they might see a flicker of light in the windows, a faint echo of the lost souls forever trapped within the shadows of the house. By morning, Hollowbrook House stood silent, doors shut and windows lifeless, concealing all traces of the 5 who had dared enter.